Welcome to How is God Calling You? A production of CTNY, the Catholic television network of Youngstown. It is a show that seeks to stimulate and assist youth and young adults to discover the path that God has chosen for them. Vocations to the priesthood, religious life, marriage, and single life will all be discussed. Your program host is Father James Corda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of How is God Calling You? Today we're going to talk with the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. And joining me in today's show is Sister Mary McCormack. And Sister Mary, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
You know, in our first segment, we'd like to talk in general about vocations and how does one know that they have a vocation, what a vocation's all about. I think I'd like us to focus on how does someone know that they have a vocation to religious life as opposed to a career or a job? How does one really know that?
Sure. I think for young people, and today, of course, when you're talking about young people, you're talking about everybody from high school students to young adults all the way up to the age of 40. There's a long process that they go through about determining what they want to do with life. Part of it does involve kind of trying to figure out what you're good at, the kinds of things that are suited to you and to your personality. And I think combined with that is a sense of where's God in your life. And so a vocation really comes not so much out of what job you're good at, but how God is calling you in your life. In the church, we believe that there are many vocations. The vocation to priesthood, to religious life, to the permanent diaconate, to married life, to parenthood. And I think people really need to focus on how God is active in their lives and kind of combine that with some of the gifts and talents that they have naturally.
I like the line that you said, we look for something that we're good at. You know, and I think that's so important, especially in responding to a vocation, because so many people are very unhappy with the work or the career that they've chosen in life,
right,
and for some reason are kind of stuck in it. Why is it so important to really like being a sister or being a priest? What is that all about, and how important is that component?
Well, I think it's a vital component for anybody who's choosing consecrated life or the priesthood. First of all, the whole point of that kind of life is to serve God and God's people. And at the heart of that ought to be a certain joy that comes with living the gospel life and a certain happiness about life in general. And so I think what a person does in trying to discern a vocation is really try to say, how can I be of help to God and God's people? How can I be an ambassador of the gospel? And is this going to make me happy? You know, in the old days when people would look at the Baltimore Catechism, that was one of the first questions. God made us so that we could be happy, first in this life and then ultimately with Him in heaven. And I think sometimes people forget that happiness is really at the core of living a good Christian life.
You know, and sometimes people have a misconception that I have to be a certain way, or I have to know everything that there is to know about being Catholic, or I've had to read the Bible from beginning to end. And that's what will help me become a better sister or respond to the call. But it's not necessarily fitting into a particular category that you respond to a call. How do we kind of dispel that myth that we have to fit into this category in order to be a sister or a priest?
Yeah, I think I'd start with some of the basic beliefs that we have as a Christian community about who we are. Already we're made in God's image and likeness. Already God has gifted us with many things. And when God calls any particular person, any high school student, any college student, any young adult, God calls them with the gifts and talents that they have. So God's not looking that we all fit some preconceived mode. Rather, God takes each person as they are with the gifts and talents they've been given and with whatever kind of likes they have and says, here's the person that I want to help proclaim the good news for this time in history.
And what about that whole sense of the call to holiness? Some people don't feel holy enough or feel worthy enough. How do we kind of assuage that feeling that they might have in trying to respond to that call?
That is one of the things that I think has been a new emphasis in the Church, especially since the Second Vatican Council. One of the central documents of the Second Vatican Council was a document on the Church. And as the Church put that together, the Council Fathers put that together. Right in the center of the document is a chapter that's entitled The Call to Holiness. And it reminds us that everybody's called to holiness. And part of that holiness, I think, is linked to happiness. That we really will be happy in life. We'll be happy with our life circumstances, with our job, with our relationships, to the extent that we also try to be holy. And sometimes I think that holiness, we had an image of it that I have to be set apart, I have to be different. If we think about who God is, the very nature of God for us Christians is God is triune. There's this unity of people. The best way we live out holiness, I think, is in that unity of persons. And so it's in and through our relationships. Sometimes, for many people, if their vocation is marriage and parenthood, those relations are with their spouse, with their children, with their in-laws. But for people who are consecrated religious or priests, the holiness is with the members of their parish, their religious community, and the people with whom they live and work. That holiness is lived out in relation.
What about a support system that someone, I think, needs in order to respond to the call? Whether it's a parental approval or a peer approval, how important is that? Because let's face it, there are probably parents out there who actually don't want their son or daughter to enter religious life. How do we kind of talk about that whole situation that's, I think, a reality? It
is a reality. And as you mentioned, we all need a support system. Let me contrast it again for somebody who chooses marriage. When someone chooses marriage, you kind of have a built-in support system in that your spouse is part of your support system, and then your children are part of your support system as well. For someone who chooses priesthood or religious life, ideally, family is also supportive and friends are also supportive. But a religious community is going to be supportive, a diocese is going to be supportive, and the community of faith, that larger community of faith, is also going to be supportive. One of the fears I think that parents have is that a son or a daughter who's thinking about religious life or the priesthood will not be happy, and that's one of their fears. I think if they can see their children happy, that's going to allay many of those fears. And even if they're not initially supportive, I think they might eventually come to support the choice that they've made. The other thing is, both for consecrated life and for priesthood, the church builds in a long process. When one expresses an interest, it doesn't mean that's the direction I'm going on forever. Someone who goes to the seminary has a long period of time before ordination. Someone who enters consecrated life equally has a long period of time before they get to the point of final vows. So there's a long period when somebody can say, yes, this is for me, or no, this isn't for me. And it's during that time that I think that support can grow among family and friends.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about that whole process that I think we would term discernment? And there's obviously various steps that we need to take. Why is that discernment process so important and imperative to responding to the call? Because it's not something we do lightly, or it's not something we do overnight. So how important is that, and what are some of those steps that we take for discerning?
First of all, let me talk a little bit about discernment. The whole concept of discernment is trying to make choices and make decisions, often about two goods, because I think in this case we're talking about between two goods or three goods, sometimes between good and evil, sometimes between two evils. So there are a variety of ways that one can make a discernment. And a discernment is a process by which we try to identify, here's where I think God is calling me in light of the gifts and talents that have been given to me. When you think about a discernment to religious life, for example, I think you start that discernment with a sense of there's kind of an inward attraction, an attraction to serving God's people, to living a life of faith, to kind of being involved in the church. That's kind of the first inclination. The second comes with, I think I might want to do it with this group of people. These people seem to do it well. These people seem to really make a difference in people's lives. These people seem happy, So that's kind of a second part of it. And then I think there are some parallels between dating someone and the kind of discernment that one might go through for religious life. Not exactly the same, but there are some parallels. There's a little bit of a getting to know you time. You know, the getting to know you time is you hang out with them. You do some things with them. You engage in the ministries they're engaged in. You join them in prayer. If there's still a sense of, gosh, I like this way of life, I like these people, you know, and it's not just an initial, I'm going to do this, but as I hang out with them, I like it a little bit more, you might get more deeply involved.
You use the phrase getting to know you, and that would be, I think, almost a two-way street, getting to know the individual in who is responding to this call, but them getting to know themselves as to who they are, why is God calling me at this particular time in my life. How do you help someone get more in touch with what's going on inside?
You're exactly right. It is always a two-way process. The person gets to know the religious community better, and the person gets to know themselves better. And that's a really important part of it. I always say to young people, if they're interested in religious life or if they're interested in priesthood, and especially even in our first conversation, one of the things I always say is, as you engage in this, you're going to find out more and more about yourself. And there's going to be a depth that you find about yourself. Sometimes in our culture, we don't emphasize that depth dimension very well. But anyone who's pursuing religious life or priesthood, they're also going to have to get in touch with that depth dimension. And that's always a good thing. And no matter what choice the person makes, the more they come to know the depth of their inner self, the more they're going to be able to be happy in life.
We're down to the last 2 minutes before we take a break. And I don't want to end on a negative note, but what if someone is in this discernment process and maybe actually takes the step and becomes a priest or a sister, and then at some point decides, this isn't where God is calling me? Is that our right at that point to make another decision?
Certainly, I think that has happened, and we've seen it, I think, more frequently since the Second Vatican Council than we did before. But I think, you know, we're living a longer lifespan now, and sometimes God can give a second call. And people end up saying, this did fit me for a while, and maybe now it doesn't. Though there is a permanency that comes with final vows and ordination, and I don't want to undermine that permanency. Sometimes people have gotten into it and then said, my life has taken a different direction, or something else has happened, and maybe I need to rethink the commitment that I made.
And before we take a break, I think I'd like us to go back and start with those who made the decision later on in life to enter religious life or priesthood. And so we're going to talk about that in a moment.
Okay, great.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I am Maryknoll.
Je suis Maryknoll.
I am Maryknoll.
I believe that we are all connected to each other, and that it is the gift of compassion that unites us and makes us one. It doesn't matter what language, culture, or tradition we come from. We can share compassion wherever we are.
Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Maryknoll dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, and with your help, they can do more. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Maryknoll.
I am Maryknoll.
Yo soy Maryknoll.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Maryknoll.
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 Welcome back to our show, How is God Calling You? We're talking with Sister Mary McCormack of the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown. Before we went to a break, we talked about someone who enters religious life or priesthood and then at some point decides it's not for them. But there are those that are entering, at least now, later on in life, almost as a second career.
Right.
How has that been your experience with some of the women in your community?
We have seen it in our community. And I think there are a variety of factors that lead to that decision. One is people are living longer. And not only are they living longer, but they're living more healthy lives. I mean, even in their older years, they're healthy. And so while in another era you might have thought a person might be in ministry for 30 or 40 years, today it's very typical among our members that they're in ministry for 50, 60, even 70 years. And so we have had the experience, and not only us, but lots of religious communities have had the experience that people come to us a bit older, maybe in their late 30s, 40s, even 50s. And they say, you know, maybe as a young person I thought about this, but perhaps I had debt, perhaps I had family responsibilities. In some cases, people did get married and had a family, but now perhaps their spouses died, their children are not only out of high school, but usually have their own careers and their own families. And these people come and say, an attraction I might have felt in high school is back again. And would you give me a chance to think about this? We have had it, and it actually, in many cases, has worked very successfully.
I wonder if that brings me to another question, and it might be kind of a out there question, but I'm wondering if the call from God isn't more among people than we actually know or understand or comprehend, that God has called many people, if not all people, to a particular way of life. And obviously we know that as Christians we're called to live a particular way of life. But I'm wondering if the religious call or call to ministry is not a little more widespread than we understand. So if that's the case, what can we do? What examples can we be to those people to help them discern more that yeah, I do have a call? How do we do that?
Right, I think you're precisely on target here. Not only are we all called to live holiness, you know, through the gospel in light of our baptism, but I think God does call us, and that's really the value of the Christian community. I think whatever Christian community we find ourselves in, for I think most people it's a parish community, but there may be other groups, perhaps a faith-sharing group or a Bible study group, that even within those settings, we have a responsibility to help one another identify gifts. And it really doesn't matter what point in life. Many people who choose lay ecclesial ministry always talk about it in terms of a call. They always talk about it as a sense of, it's not only something I think I might be good at, it's not only something I think I'd like to do, but I really think God is calling me to this. And so that sense of a broad vocation for people in lay ecclesial ministry, but also to religious life, is something that really the church has a responsibility to call forth. Not that we go around tagging people, but I think when we meet someone, we might say to them, I think you have some gifts for service. I think you have some gifts for ministry. Have you ever thought about consecrated life? Have you ever thought about being a permanent deacon? Have you ever thought about the priesthood? Those are the kinds of things that I think help build up the body of Christ and build up God's reign here on earth.
And we all know that we have, each of us, particular gifts and talents. And which brings me to another point of discussion that I'd like us to spend a little time on, and that is that whole concept of charism. We know that charism means a gift, and so every religious community has a charism, a particular gift that someone is attracted to or drawn to. So share with us the particular charism of religious life, but also of the Ursuline sisters.
Sure. You're exactly right. A charism is a gift. And the whole concept of religious life is already a gift to the church. It's not part of the order of the church. It's an extra gift that God has given. And we look back and we say it's been in the church for thousands of years, so it's already a long-standing gift. And within that general gift of religious life to the church, God has called forth particular charismatic leaders. St. Angela Merici was one of them. Angela Merici was the founder of the Ursulines, and that was at a time in the church when there was a great deal of turmoil and a great deal of difficulty during the Reformation. Angela had a couple of things that were kind of giving her an impetus to start something new. One is, she did want to be faithful to the church. Though there was a lot of dissension within the Christian community, she always made a choice to say, I want to be faithful to the Catholic Church and all that that has with it, the sacramental life, the life of prayer of the church, all of the part of the hierarchy of the church that's there Angela wanted to be faithful to that. Second, though, she said, I have this sense of a call to holiness, but not in monasticism. Monasticism was the common kind of religious life at the time. She said, I don't think I want to live a monastic life. I want to be engaged in people and engaged in ministry. So that was another gift. A third thing I think she did was recognize very well what the needs of the times were. In her own setting. In northern Italy in the early 16th century, one of the big problems was that many young women had been kind of thrown out of their homes and were not eligible for marriage. In part it was because there were lots of wars among the city-states in Italy at the time, and as is always the case in war, one of the tragedies of war is that people use rape as a weapon. And these young women would be raped. They were no longer eligible for marriage. Their families were shamed by this, and so often these young women had nothing to do. Angela brought them in, taught them some skills. Now, we're not talking about getting a job in a factory here, but taught them skills of housekeeping, reading, sewing, and then helped them to find work among some of the other people in town. Now, that's the heart of Ursuline's becoming good educators, but she really didn't start schools. She really tried to say, what's the need at the time? Ursulines have a long history of being known as educators, and certainly that's a heritage that we're proud of. At the same time, I think the real gift that Angela gave was a gift of flexibility, of reading the signs of the time, and of networking. Now, she never would have used the word networking, but what I mean by that is she really brought together a variety of people. In her day, it was some of the widows who lived in town, it was some business people, businessmen in particular, it was working with the clergy at the time, and these young women. She brought them, all of these groups together, who really didn't know each other, but brought them together, and it was for the good of the church.
You know, you mentioned charismatic leaders that really began these religious orders and communities, but one of their most perfect gifts was reading the signs of the times and understanding what is the need right now in this day and age in God's church that I need to respond to. And bringing that up to date now, how important is it for us to look at the signs of the times and maybe try to understand the differences that might be in religious life or in responding to a vocation or to a call in the church? How can I then best answer what's going on right now? How important is that?
Oh, I think it's critically important because we are in a time of transition in the church. I don't think it's as desperate as the time of the Reformation. But clearly the church has had a whole lot of challenges, and religious life has had a lot of challenges. I think one of the things for us as Ursulines, but I think for anybody who's faithful to the gospel, is to say, how do we continue to be church? And how do we do that in a changing time? One of the things we know in our own culture, and there are a lot of reasons for this, but there aren't as many Catholic schools as there once were. For decades, that was the kind of ministry that Ursulines and many other religious women were engaged in. Today, for a whole host of reasons, there are not as many schools, and we don't have as many sisters either. There was a need for new ministry, and sisters were the ones who began those new ministries. In a way, it's always looking at who are the people that are underserved, who are the people who have kind of gotten lost. In Angela's day, the people that had gotten lost are these young women who had nobody to care for them. One of the things that we do today is to say, who are the people that have gotten lost, and how can we be of service to them? And that's kind of the networking. Because of all of our contacts with our former students, we do have some influence with people. We are faithful to the church. We maintain good contacts with the clergy. We like to think that we're doing the same thing that Angela did, but it's a new group of people now. It's not young girls who are abandoned by their family. It may be people who are homeless. It may be people who live with AIDS and all of the things that happen with AIDS. It may be people who are poor. It may be people who dropped out of the educational system at one point in their lives, maybe in high school, and now want to start up education again. We kind of like to think that education isn't just from kindergarten through grade 12. We like to think of it now as an effort that begins as a very young child and continues out the life cycle.
We're coming down to the last 2 minutes of our time together. I'd like us to try to think in our mind some questions that we would perhaps leave with the people that are with us. Questions about if they're thinking about religious life or priesthood, what's a question that they might want to ask themselves? Or if they're someone who can promote vocations,
Sure.
What are some questions that we can give to them to help?
Sure. I think one of the questions for somebody who might be considering himself or herself, I'm looking at a life of service to the church. I think the question really gets to the depth of the person. Can I recognize God's presence enough in my life? And do I recognize the gifts that God has given me so that I can use them for service? So that's part of it. I think a third question that's linked to those: are there voices from other parts of my life? Co-workers, family members, members of my parish community. Are there voices from other parts of my life that say, you know, you really do have a generous spirit. You really do have a sense of spirituality. If I hear those voices, I might say, maybe I need to check this out more. I think that's for the person who's saying, I'm thinking about it myself, all right? For people in the parish community, what can they do? I think we do need to look at the members of our faith community, whatever that is, you know, our Bible study group, our faith sharing group, our parish, people who work with us on various committees in the parish, and say, is there someone here that does show a depth of spirituality, does have a happiness of life, and does have some gifts that really could be at the use of the service of the people of God? If we recognize those in one another, not to just say, you have to do this with your life, but you might challenge that person, whether they're 16 or 18 or 25 or 35 or 45. You might say to that person, have you ever considered this? Because I think you have some gifts that might make you a good religious, a good permanent deacon, a good priest. And that's what the church needs to do.
Well, Sister Mary, we certainly appreciate your presence on our show, and God bless you in your ministry and in your work with the Ursulines.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
How is God Calling You is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Corda.
$33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.